Welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming to this event, which is obviously about something which is not only important in itself, but extremely timely. You'll hear something from me. I'm David Jones. I'm the director of the Anscombe Centre. But before that, we'll hear from Dr. Dominic Whitehouse, who is a palliative care consultant. But to start us off, I would invite Bishop Richard, if you could say a few words in prayer. Thank you.
David, thank you. And just before we do, a word of thanks to you and to Dominic and to Father Stephen Dingley with his OGF hat on for facilitating this gathering. So let us pray. Lord, we thank you for calling us together at the service of your people. We pray for an openness to the wonder of the gift of life in our society, from the very moment of conception to natural death. We pray for all who are members of our communities, especially in this diocese, that we may do all we can to foster this respect for life and to prompt those in positions of authority in government to respect the dignity of life given to us by God. We make these prayers through Christ our Lord. Amen. Our Lady, seat of wisdom, pray for us. Saint Philip Howard, pray for us. Saint Charles Borromeo, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
So can you all see my slides before we start? Yep. Okay, my Lord, Reverend Fathers, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming, as David says. So I'm speaking late today to some MPs in Parliament, and I thought I'd make you all my guinea pigs and run my talk by you. I hope you don't mind. I think there's helpful information for you as well, so don't worry. The subject is really important, given the implications of Kim Leadbeater's bill, implications for patients, for healthcare, and for society more generally. So this is me on the slide. I've been a palliative care consultant in a hospice on the South Coast now for the last 9 years. Before that, I was a doctor for various international organisations, for the NHS and in the military, in both respiratory medicine and intensive care. I've worked all over the world in all sorts of situations, but it's palliative medicine, where I'm working now, where I'm most at home. I really love my work, and I really love the hospice I work in, and I really want to make sure we continue to make the difference at the end of life that we are doing. Assisted dying would torpedo our practice and ethos below the waterline, and the good we do would be lost. I've looked after people dying in war zones, in NHS wards, in an Ebola hospital in Sierra Leone during the outbreak there, and now I do it in our local hospice. And everywhere the needs are the same. They're best understood by looking at hospices and the palliative care that's practiced there. I'll focus on the secular and rational arguments today. You're the experts on moral philosophy and church teaching. There will be a few statistics, there will be a bit of emotion, but hopefully it will all be bearable. So I'll set the scene for the MPs and for you by telling you about 𝘗𝘓𝘭𝘭𝘪𝘴𝘵 who was one of our patients. She was a lovely but very troubled lady from overseas with advanced breast cancer. She'd had several years of intensive treatment, and after initial improvement, though, her cancer had spread and it was now in her bones and in her liver. She also had complex social circumstances. She'd been married several times and she'd had several abusive relationships. And there'd been a recent family suicide, adding to the crisis. Although she was on our hospice books, she kept herself at arm's length initially, but her GP asked us to increase our contact because her symptoms were getting worse. She was losing weight and it was in pain, and she developed infected sores on her arm, which had swollen enormously due to the cancer getting into the lymph nodes and the lymph channels, which take the fluid away. She found that horrific. She couldn't even look at her arm. So one of our specialist nurses from the hospice visited and got her to come in, reluctantly, albeit, for a symptom control admission for the sores and for the severe bone pain. She was in a really bad place, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. She'd had enough. She wanted to die. She was really suffering in so many ways. And when she arrived, she was dismissive of our help. She spent nearly all day in bed, and she asked for something to end it all. She wanted to be alone, but after a few days listening to her, showing her we understood, explaining her symptoms and how we could relieve them, and getting her to believe she had some living left to do, we were able to relieve much of her pain and anguish. It was our fantastic nurses in the hospice that made that possible. They're the real experts at breaking down barriers and getting close to the patients. So Consuelo was able to sit up and talk and laugh again with staff and with family, and started going to art classes and alternative therapy spa treatments in our day hospice. After 2 weeks, she managed to go home for a day and then for longer periods. Eventually, she stayed for a fortnight with visits from her overseas relatives. And at that time, she was being supported by our hospice nurses and our family support team of social workers and chaplains. But then one night, she suddenly became much weaker. She came back to the hospice, where she was able to smile at the staff looking after her and share a few quiet words before she died very peacefully that night, with her physical symptoms and her spiritual distress under control. So if you address fears, treat symptoms as best you can, but most importantly, accompany the suffering person, you can achieve wonders. So this is a roadmap of where we'll go next. We'll take a brief dive into palliative care, what it is, how it's delivered and where, the problems it's facing, and hopefully debunk some myths about it. And then we'll move on to assisted dying, what it is, how it's delivered around the world, some arguments for and against it, and its potential impacts here. So as we travel this road, we'll see it's the opposite of true compassionate end-of-life care. So starting with the palliative care approach, this lovely lady is Dame Cicely Saunders. She put palliative care and hospice medicine on a modern scientific footing, and we think of her as the founding mother, really, of our specialty. As an aside, this is for you, but not for the MPs, although she wasn't a Catholic, she first experienced palliative care working at St. Joseph's Hospice in Hackney, run by the Sisters of Charity there. So her great quotation here on the slide captures the ethos of palliative care and all good end-of-life care. So you matter because you are you, and you matter to the end of your life. We will do all we can, not only to help you die peacefully, but also to live until you die. It's completely patient-centred, it's hopeful, and it affirms the true dignity of the sick person. And the World Health Organization gets in on the act. It recognises these 9 elements of good palliative care. I'll give you a second to look at them. They emphasise how it embraces the whole person, their physical symptoms, but also their psychological and spiritual distress, and it supports both the sick person and their loved ones. But most importantly, it affirms life. It accepts dying is inevitable, but it's emphatically not about hastening that death. And especially in hospices, it relies on great teamwork. So dignity, well, this is talked about a lot in relation to dying, and supporters of assisted dying maintain it equates to autonomy, and that this autonomy gives a right to assisted dying. In palliative care, we take a different view. We see it as something inherent in every human being. This concept of dignity was what was presented by the Vatican in Dignitas Infinita, which explains human dignity is because man is made in God's image. It mirrors the concept of dignity found in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where such inherent dignity requires us to recognise the other for who they are, to be present for them and recognise their worth. And it recognises the value of human life. P.S. I left out the Dignitas Infinita bit for the MPs. So, compassion is also fundamental to good healthcare. It comprises a suffering with the other person, accompanying them, as we say, and also acting to relieve their distress. It's different from the concept of compassion used to argue for accelerated dying. That interpretation avoids pressure to share the suffering by ducking the issue, by ending the life. And it can send a message that life is not worth living. But while often well-intentioned, that mentality really abandons patients, and it's the antithesis of our palliative care approach. So in the UK, much palliative care is based in hospices. These are centres of excellence for care of the dying and the terminally ill. People are often under hospices for months or years, and sometimes just a few days or hours. And generally, they have 3 components. There's an inpatient unit, the community service, and the day hospice. And the inpatient unit is what people think of when they hear the word hospice, really, sort of halfway between a hospital room and the patient's home. People come in for 2 main reasons. Firstly, control of difficult symptoms, such as pain, anxiety, shortness of breath. And secondly, at the end of life care then, if it's hospice, where they want to be when they die. Of course, people move between categories as their illness progresses and sometimes come in and out of the hospice several times. But note, around half of those admitted go home. It's not a one-way ticket. And that's one of the misconceptions about hospice care. And the second component is the community team. And the two main services there are nurse specialists, very experienced senior nurses, often previous ward sisters or nurse managers, who are also prescribers. And they support people at home and liaise with other services they need, often over long periods of time in the last few months or even years of life. And then there's hospice at home. Here we have hands-on nurses and care assistants who provide care during the last short few days of life. They allow patients to stay at home if that's where they wish to be when they die. Then our third component there in the middle, that's the day hospice. It has a clinic with physio-led breathlessness and exercise classes, with counselling, complementary therapies, and art and music activities, things like that. So sorry now, we've got a few statistics coming up. So there are 2/3 deaths per year in the UK, and half of those take place at home or in care home nursing homes. 6% are in hospices, and the rest are in hospital. And increasingly, they too have their own palliative care teams. But it's important to remember, many of those dying at home or in care homes are also under the local hospice through the community teams. They visit and advise family and professional carers and link them to the hospice specialists. And remember, when asked, most people don't want to die in hospital. Home or hospice is preferred. Now, funding of hospices and palliative care is hugely important, both directly for the care available to people, but also, and most importantly perhaps, because it's pivotal in the assisted dying debate. Currently in the UK, our 200 hospices care for around 300,000 people each year, and the quality of that care is the best in the world, but it's severely underfunded. It survives on charitable fundraising. On average, the NHS only gives a third of the costs to the hospice, and smaller hospices receive less. It's around 13% where I work. As a result of that, there's around 100,000 people who die without good palliative care and hospice care that they need each year in the UK. And it's this under-provision, i.e. a quarter of people excluded, that's clearly terrible, both for those people who are not getting the treatment, but also for their relatives and for society, because bad deaths amplify the calls for assisted dying. So a parliamentary report earlier this year found the current model of hospice funding is not fit for purpose. It's inequitable. The spending across the country varies from £10.33 to just 23 pence per head per year. And the demand is going to keep going up as our population ages, and we expect 25% more deaths every year by 2048. And despite this, the ICBs, that's the funding bodies in the NHS, provide lower funding increases for hospices than other local NHS services. So with these financial constraints, hospices are reducing services and making staff redundant. And this is leading to people dying in avoidable pain, as in this report here. And this leads in turn to more pressure for assisted dying. But where assisted dying has been legalised, there's good evidence that it's bad for end-of-life care. This study on this slide of European countries shows the increases in palliative care spending over the period 2005 to 2019. And it shows that palliative care spending is much lower in the countries which allow assisted dying than those which do not allow it. It's true for hospices, hospitals, or community settings. So compare the blue columns, which are the countries where assisted dying is not allowed, with the grey columns where it is allowed for each setting. And you can see the great difference in increase in spending between those two groups. And there's further evidence. This comparison of data about the quality of the end-of-life care across the world shows how things changed between 2015 and 2021 in two reports. It's very telling. So the three places with the best provision, including the UK, have not legalised assisted dying. In fact, only one of the top 10 has, and that's Australia, and its ranking has fallen. And as you'll see, most places permitting assisted dying fell in the rankings, often by many places. In Canada, things are so bad that the Vancouver authorities there stopped funding Irene Thomas Hospice there because it refused to undertake assisted dying. So please, and this is really a plea to the MPs, don't believe those who claim palliative care isn't adversely affected when assisted dying is legalised, because it is. And you'll know the NHS too is in crisis. It nearly always is. The recent 𝘗𝘗𝘭𝘭𝘪𝘢𝘵 report, which you might have heard about, highlights how bad things really are. And these are perhaps the most relevant findings on the right, relevant to the assisted dying debate, but I'll just flag a couple of them. The huge increase in the number of patients per GP, which is worst in deprived communities, and the fact that more than 2 million people are waiting for community services or mental health assessments. And the danger is all these could make people feel assisted dying is the only way out. And the public is suspicious that assisted dying is all about cutting costs, perhaps not unreasonably. In 2017, Canadian economists showed assisted dying could provide health budget savings of $139 million per year, compared with normal care. And that will increase greatly as eligibility for assisted dying is broadened, as we'll discuss later. Professor Mark Glazer, who's a UK cancer specialist, recently warned, if assisted dying is legalised, it will create a culture of hopelessness in the NHS. It will be a disaster for patients. And he went on to add, but it might be good for the NHS budget. So what about assisted dying? I'll use these definitions here on this slide from the government website. The umbrella term is assisted dying, which includes euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. Euthanasia means healthcare professionals, usually doctors, administering lethal drugs directly to their patient. Assisted suicide, on the other hand, is healthcare professionals prescribing lethal drugs for their patient to take themselves. Other euphemisms are used elsewhere. In Canada, it's called MAID, M-A-I-D, medical assistance in dying. And in Australia, it's VAD, voluntary assistance in dying. But like the term assisted dying itself, these are used to avoid the negative connotations. In reality, though, they're all situations where health staff either help people to kill themselves or directly end the lives of the patients. Morally, there's little or no difference. And what's happening around the world? So far, it's legal in a handful of mainly rich, developed countries in Europe, North America, and the Commonwealth. In some places, assisted suicide alone is allowed. In others, it's both assisted suicide and euthanasia. Assisted dying champions highlight that 350 million people now have access to it, and they hail this as great progress. But remember, with 8 billion people in the world, that's only 1 in 25 who can legally have their lives shortened by their doctors. And also, there are 195 countries in the world. Of those, very few permit it. And if we maintain the status quo here, we'll be in very good company with the vast majority of the world's people and the world's countries. So what about the UK? So the initial strategy of the assisted dying champions is decriminalisation of assisted suicide for just the terminally ill. At present, that's illegal under the 1961 Suicide Act and could lead to imprisonment, in theory. But there have only been 4 convictions, for it in the last 15 years. However, at the same time, 8 cases have been prosecuted for homicide and other serious crimes which were initially thought to be assisted suicide. And this means we really do need to be very careful about removing this legal safety net. In Britain, euthanasia itself is considered murder. And we've seen many attempts to legalise assisted dying over the years, and they always quote surveys and opinion polls as part of their justification. We'll come back to them in a minute. But now we've got this Leadbeater bill, which means legalisation looks possible. And this makes it vitally important that people write to their MPs, and even better, speak to them and ask them to both vote against assisted dying in the debates and also to try to influence others to do the same thing. So moving on a bit, so people wanting to legalise assisted dying argue in public on grounds of autonomy and choice and a wish to relieve suffering, as we mentioned before. But in the media and in campaign materials, there's big misuse of statistics and often misrepresentation, it might actually be misunderstanding about what good end-of-life care is and how effective it is. And conversely, about the serious problems where assisted dying is already legal, such as Oregon, which we'll talk about as we go through. So keep listening. So first, what about these polls? They apparently show public support for assisted dying, but there are big problems with how they're conducted. Generally, they're online. They select from panels of people who signed up for surveys, often for payment or other emoluments. And clearly, this disadvantages those without a computer or internet access, the illiterate, those with visual impairment, perhaps mental disability, the very people likely to be impacted by assisted dying. It excludes those most likely to be affected, the terminally ill, and it misses the views of another main stakeholder, health professionals, because both groups have too much to do to bother doing surveys. And secondly, there are big problems with survey design and question wording. For example, one study investigating this asked, do you support the idea of euthanasia? And 79% of people said yes. But when the same people are asked, do you believe a doctor should be able to deliberately bring about a patient's death? Only 34% of people were in agreement. And this overlaps with the third real problem. People don't understand the terms used. So if they're asked, do you support assisted dying being made legal? They think it includes allowing do not resuscitate or withdrawal of burdensome treatments. And both of those are already illegal in the UK and not part of assisted dying. Some even think it means having good palliative care while dying. And as we've seen, that's the opposite of shortening life by assisted suicide or euthanasia. And finally, as it becomes more topical and people learn more about what's at stake and about the concerns of doctors and other experts, for example, in Scotland, numbers strongly in favour of assisted dying are falling in the polls as more people hear about how doctors and lawyers think it's not a good idea. Last week's Observer carried this article about palliative care doctors highlighting the danger of introducing assisted dying here, despite poor provision and underfunding of care. And hopefully such clarifications as this will make you lawmakers, as I'll tell the MPs, think twice. And it does seem public views are indeed changing and more nuanced than previously. So Dignity in Dying, their own recent poll, showed overall only 43% want MPs to vote for assisted dying and only 24% of Black and Asian voters. And among faith groups, support was lowest among Muslims at only 19%. It was also low in the 18 to 34-year-olds, and among UK regions, it was lowest in London. So the public are now getting more cautious and less supportive, and Parliament arguably should be even more so. So moving on now to people's reasons for requesting hastened death for themselves. And these are very different from the arguments used in public for legalisation, and they're consistent internationally. In reports from Canada and Oregon, they're mainly due to existential suffering, including loss of dignity or loss of control or fear of dying itself or fear of unpleasant symptoms in the future, but not by uncontrolled actual symptoms at the time. Most worryingly, in Oregon, nearly 50% report feeling a burden as their reason, and over 8% cite financial concerns. And both of those proportions have increased over the years, and both are red flags for coercion and inequality. And clearly, assisted dying does nothing to help such suffering and fears. But sadly, these requests also show people don't understand how effective good palliative care can be. We do have techniques to address existential suffering, as you in the clergy will know. Most specifically, we explore what's important to patients in their lives, their understanding of their own dignity and worth, and their fears, and then address those. And this dignity therapy is part of listening and accompanying patients. They realise their life still does have worth. And depression and hopelessness are involved. They make requests for hastened death much more likely. In one study, 1 in 4 terminally ill people with either depression or hopelessness, that's a pessimistic outlook on life, wanted hastened death. And for those who had both, depression and hopelessness, it was 2/3. We know depression is common in the terminally ill, in around 50%, and we know it's often missed. But depression is both more likely if someone is suffering, and it is itself a cause of intense suffering. It's treatable. And most importantly, untreated, it impairs decision-making, and that might be decisions such as whether to request assisted dying. We're really vigilant for it in palliative care. And hopelessness too can be helped with psychology input, for example, CBT, or spiritual interventions from chaplains and clergy. But would these problems be identified and treated in all assisted dying requests, especially when we have such serious underprovision of palliative and mental health care here in the UK? In Oregon, only 0.8% of patients get psychiatric evaluation beforehand. This really does risk missing depression and hopelessness and could impact the quality of mental capacity assessments as well. It's unlikely the UK would be any better. So why is it bad for patients? Well, first off, what happens where it's legal? Numbers go up inexorably, as you can see in the Netherlands, Belgium, Oregon and Canada here. In the Netherlands and Belgium, it's been legal for a long time and still the numbers go up. In Canada, assisted dying is nearly always euthanasia, but it's increasing by 30%, more than 30% per year. Already 4%, that's 1 in 25 of all deaths are performed in Canada by their healthcare professionals. In the Netherlands, it's more than 5%, and in Belgium, it's more than 2.5%. But we know there's significant underreporting in both those countries, so the numbers and proportions are really higher. In Oregon, assisted dying numbers are a bit lower, but increasing, as you can see, year on year. But also note, a third of the patients get prescriptions but don't use them. The people at the top are the number of prescriptions, the number at the bottom is the number of deaths due to assisted dying. So people change their minds. And the law is often tested. For example, we see criminal prosecutions for non-voluntary euthanasia of dementia patients in the Netherlands, and the law becomes ever more permissive. You must have heard about Canada. There, it's no longer just for terminal disease. Death no longer even needs to be reasonably foreseeable. So looking closely at the figures on this graph, the last 2 years include these numbers in red at the top of the columns. They're the percentage of made deaths performed on people who weren't dying. Their death was not reasonably foreseeable, and this is now allowed by Canadian law. They've now legislated to even allow it for mental health problems. It's already being offered to the handicapped instead of providing aids for daily living or modifying their housing. And this mission creeps happening elsewhere too. So assisted dying is accessible, but helps live a fulfilled life is withheld. There are other reasons it's bad for patients. Diagnosis and prognosis are both often wildly inaccurate. Firstly, diagnosis can be wrong. For example, we know cancer can be missed, as in this story about missed cancer, but equally worrying, sometimes things are diagnosed as cancer when it's something else. And then prognosis. How long someone has left is never as accurate as people think. We see both extremes, people given short weeks to live by their oncologist who are still alive after a year, or people told will be around next Christmas, months away, who are already desperately ill and die a week later. In Oregon in 2023, we know from official reports that 5%, that's 1 in 20, of those prescribed assisted dying drugs were still alive more than 6 months later, even though the law says it's only allowed for those with less than 6 months prognosis. They don't get it right there either. And this sort of imprecision causes fear and anxiety and loss of trust with the medical profession. It may be part of the demand for assisted dying. And then there are problems with the medications. Assisted suicide drugs, which are taken by mouth, taste awful. They're difficult to take because large quantities are needed and supplies are not always guaranteed. The medications are not licensed for killing people. No drugs are, and they're often used experimentally. Oregon is on its 4th combination of drugs already. They also cause distressing side effects, such as vomiting or seizures. Again, in Oregon, this happens in 10% of assisted suicides, where the information is available. Worryingly, the information is only available for a third of deaths because it's only recorded if there's a health professional present at the time. And that only happens in a third of deaths. And also in Oregon, assisted dying records are destroyed there after only 1 year. So the drugs may not work. People wake up after taking the medications rather than dying. And in one Dutch study, several of those wanting assisted suicide had to be euthanized instead with a lethal injection. And for those that do work, the Oregon report tells us the medications can take up to 6 days to kill the patient. So where's the dignity in that sort of a death? For euthanasia, injected drugs are used, usually including a sedative, that's a knockout drug, plus a drug to paralyze the patient's muscles. Then is sedate, then paralyze, so when unconscious, breathing muscles stop and they die. But if paralysis kicks in first, death could be awful. It could be suffocating, not able to breathe while still aware. And we'd never know. No one is alive to report back. We do know that anaesthetists tell us patients can be aware during operations in hospitals, despite adequate doses of the same medications. So why should assisted dying be any different? Also, we know not all doctors are good guys. Dr Harold Shipman was Britain's most prolific serial killer. 24 years ago, he was convicted of murdering 15 of his patients. But it's believed he probably killed hundreds. It's not clear why. Some were possibly for personal gain in the wills and things, but not all. It just seems he liked killing people. And not all healthcare is high standard or compassionate. You'll know about recent scandals, the avoidable deaths in 𝘗𝘁𝘭𝘭𝘪𝘴𝘵 Memorial due to the excessive doses of painkillers and sedatives given there, the furore over the Liverpool care pathway a few years ago, the 𝘗𝘢𝘭𝘪𝘴𝘵 case more recently. And of course, in this NHS perma-crisis, which we have, there's always a bed shortage. There's always pressure from management to clear those beds. And what are the implications of that? There's a big debate in Canada now about assisted dying causing untimely deaths of those on the margins of society. Only last week, Ontario government's own assisted dying monitors raised serious concerns about people being euthanized there for unmet social need rather than for medical reasons. Now, safeguarding. This is so important in relation to assisted dying. If it were allowed, how could we ensure that coercion, elder abuse, carer fatigue didn't influence the requests? These are all very real issues which we as palliative care doctors and GPs often see, but inevitably we also often miss them. The Oregon 2023 report shows that assisted dying doctors have only known patients for an average of 6 weeks before death. So how could they possibly properly assess for these things? And like in Oregon, most UK doctors, as we'll hear, do not want to take part in it. So the patient's usual doctor would rarely be involved. It's therefore likely such safeguarding issues will be missed. This is very dangerous, given that 50% of assisted dying requests, as we've heard, are because people don't wish to be a burden. And what about doctors then? Well, despite efforts by the activists, most doctors' organisations in the UK continue to oppose legalisation. A few are neutral, but none are in favour. Around the world, the American Medical Association, the World Medical Association still opposed. Notably, in the UK, the British Medical Association surveyed all its members in 2020 and found most doctors do not want to take part in assisted dying. And moreover, the ones most against it were the doctors who actually provide most of the care for dying people, the GPs, the geriatricians, the palliative care doctors, oncologists and hospital physicians. Those in favour were those not involved in patient care, such as pathologists, X-ray doctors and public health doctors. So at our recent BMA consultants conference last autumn, we passed a motion that I proposed, and that insisted that no consultant is expected to take part in any way in assisted dying. And there are good reasons for this uneasiness. Firstly, it goes against the ethos of medicine, which we learn at medical school and which guides us throughout our careers, which is based on the Hippocratic Oath, the Hippocratic approach. And that's guided Western medicine for millennia. It views doctors as having duties to their patients, to their colleagues, and society generally, with compassion and respect for the patient's inherent dignity. It mandates doctors to do no harm, and it specifically prohibits poisoning our patients, thus clearly excluding assisted suicide and euthanasia. So this original Hippocratic Oath has been brought into the modern age by the World Medical Association's Declaration of Geneva. This was urgently needed in 1948, just after the Second World War, to counter the atrocities carried out by doctors in regimes like Nazi Germany. It was felt the Hippocratic ethos had been overridden and that it needed restating. It requires the doctor to maintain utmost respect for human life. Now, most doctors do follow these ideals in the UK, and they underpin, for example, the General Medical Council's current good medical practice guidelines. So why else is it bad for doctors? Well, a Canadian palliative care professor friend, she tells me that doctors there are already having to choose alternative areas of practice if they're not willing to be involved. The Nova Scotia authorities are drafting a legal requirement to refer for assisted dying on request, and for doctors to have to tell patients it's an option, even if they don't ask, and an option as if it were a standard type of treatment. And many doctors there are going to resign if their consciences are ignored like this. So likewise, it would cause moral distress for UK doctors. I did a survey of staff and volunteers in a UK hospice, and people there would resign too if it were introduced. And this moral harm is not just because doctors recognise assisted suicide is the killing of their patients, and viewing it therefore as completely wrong. It's also because of the irreparable damage it will cause the vital, trusting relationship between doctors and patients. So if a doctor were to take part, or was even obliged to suggest it to patients, people will feel it's not only acceptable, they may also feel duty-bound to undergo it, and that would be intolerable. And what about society more generally? Well, we've seen how the numbers keep increasing where it's legal. We've mentioned the rapidly increasing eligibility in Canada and elsewhere. In the Netherlands and Belgium, patients with early stage dementia are euthanized, even though mild dementia sufferers can live for years. And in the Netherlands, also in Belgium, but in the Netherlands, terminally ill children can now be euthanized if the parents want it, where 𝘗𝘢𝘭𝘪𝘢𝘵 is concerned for the autonomy of the child there. In Oregon, they recently removed the long-standing requirement to be a resident. Furthermore, the requirement there for a terminal illness that will lead to death within 6 months is not robust. It actually also encompasses diseases which without treatment might lead to death within 6 months. So that could include conditions like diabetes or paracetamol overdose or an abnormal heart rhythm. If the patient forgoes active treatment, perhaps deliberately, they become terminal and then can demand assisted dying. And that might explain why people with diseases not usually considered terminal, such as arthritis and complications of a fall, a hernia, and anorexia nervosa, have all had assisted dying in Oregon. There truly is a slippery slope. People will say there isn't, but there is in all those jurisdictions. In fact, it's a black ski run. People originally not candidates for assisted dying are now included on so-called human rights grounds. There are already calls by a group of MPs here in Parliament to widen it to include non-terminal disease. And we also have former MP Matthew Parris calling for legalisation of assisted dying to cull the elderly infirm to conserve resources. And this move towards assisted dying, I think, reflects today's emphasis on identity and neoliberal values, and notions of collective responsibility and social justice seem to be fading. Again, looking at Oregon's report, it shows 80% of assisted dying recipients are on Medicare and Medicaid, not private insurance. And that's over twice the proportion in the general population. Those schemes are for people on low incomes, the elderly, the disabled. And this worrying year-on-year increase in the less well-off having hastened death there must be a warning to us here in the UK. And also in Western countries, there's a great focus on trying to reduce suicide rates. It had been expected that non-assisted dying suicide rates might decrease if assisted dying were allowed. Indeed, its proponents use that as a justification for it. But research shows the opposite is true. We see a 6.3% increase in background suicide rates where assisted suicide is legal. It's even greater for individuals over 65. For them, the increase is 14.5%. And thanks to David Jones for these figures. So this fits with concepts of social contagion in suicidal behaviour. It's clear you don't discourage suicide by assisting suicide. And then there's always a constant need for vigilance to ensure our civilization doesn't lose its moral compass and embrace the barbarity which necessitated the Declaration of Geneva being drafted. So before I finish, a few specific areas that might help. People brought them up in previous meetings. So firstly, motor neurone disease. People with this awful disease are often in the media arguing for assisted dying. The progressive disability and fear and dependence on others are difficult. One argument is that hastened death should be allowed for them to avoid them dying of suffocation or choking. So this chap, Noel Conway, was a respected assisted dying campaigner. He had motor neurone disease. I never met him, but he had a big influence on politicians a few years ago. And in 2017, he brought a judicial review of the UK's assisted dying ban. He felt current laws prevented his right to choose. He lost that action and he lived for another 4 years. And the ventilator, which you can see in the picture, which he needed to help him breathe and without which he would die, was finally removed at his request, as is legal. Symptoms were managed at that time by his palliative care team, and his wife said, Noel died peacefully. The hospice team, ventilation nurses, and all involved were so supportive. They ensured Noel had a painless and dignified death, demonstrating empathy and concern for us all. So he had a good death, happily. Probably better than assisted dying could have been with all its potential problems. So I've looked after lots of motor neurone disease patients at the end of their lives. With good communication, support and symptom control, they can live comfortably and die well. So this chap, Rob Burrow, the England rugby player with motor neurone disease, illustrates that point with his moving story. He spearheaded fundraising for a motor neurone disease care centre and took part in marathons right until the end. After his natural death, his father said it was obviously a very sad day, but it was peaceful. He ended his journey on his conditions. He didn't want resuscitation, is what he means. We didn't want any suffering, and he didn't suffer. It was very peaceful. Motor neuron deaths are usually peaceful. Studies show that choking as a cause of death is extremely rare. In a study of over 24 years at St. Christopher's Hospice, only one patient died choking, and that was back in 1968, shortly after they opened. In another large study across Europe, none died choking. The great majority died peacefully. Distressing death is very rare. It's no different from dying from other diseases. Patients do often have a strong fear of distressing death, though, but we can help with fear without killing the patient. So motor neuron diseases sufferers also often do have pain. As for people with other terminal illness, this needs meticulous attention to detail. You need to carefully ascertain what's causing it. You may need a combination of different classes of painkillers, and you may need to explore different routes to give them. Most importantly, any symptom, like pain, will have psychological and spiritual elements as well, and social elements. And these all need to be carefully teased out, and the pain's impact and meaning to the patient explored. So pain can be controlled adequately if these steps are followed. So then, for the MPs, I have a slide to talk about a couple of other issues that I'll keep in reserve, about morphine allergy and treating breathlessness, which we can come back to later if there's time. So we'll leave that slide out. But most importantly, as I'll tell them, for all those nearing end of life, is when they're ready, discussing with them what dying will be like, finding out what their fears are, reassuring them, and doing this openly, but going as fast or as slowly as they need. You need to explain to them that as dying gets nearer, they'll be wanting to do less, to eat and drink less, and will eventually take to their bed and spend more and more time asleep. That dying is usually very peaceful, with the breathing slowing, gaps in breathing appearing, and then it quietly stopping. There's very rarely anything unexpected or dramatic that happens. So I reassure them we can control any symptoms that do come up and that we will watch out for them. So then for the MPs, I'm going to tell them another patient anecdote about one of my MND patients. He wants to live, but he's near the end of his life, and he's made plans for where he wants to be when he does die. And the factors that will make him consider when he wants his ventilator support to be, when he'll consider it too onerous and too burdensome to continue. He'd want it stopping when he can no longer communicate. So in the hospice, we discuss assisted dying a lot. So recurring themes are fear and anxiety around the effects on our workplace, on the service we offer, and whether we would be asked to participate. And all of this is made much worse by lack of clear information, by feeling unheard, and the fear an ideological agenda is going to be imposed on us. Assisted dying would irrevocably damage the relationship between doctors and patients. It would undermine the practice of medicine, and it would also undermine the safety of the public, of the MPs, whose protection should be the first duty of government. And it would threaten the fragile but beautiful thing that is good end-of-life care. So please make sure it doesn't become legal here. A few final thoughts. First, you don't have to kill the patient either to get rid of the pain, the breathlessness, or the fear of dying, or anything else. You need to listen and recognize their personhood, their fears, and manage the symptoms very carefully. Secondly, a lot of the demand for assisted dying is because people think dying is a terrible time. But with good end-of-life care, people go away with better memories and want a good death like that for themselves. And I think you understand my views now about the situations in Canada and in Oregon. In summary, I hope you see why I think legalization of assisted dying is a really bad idea. It would harm patients, it would harm doctors and healthcare workers, and it would harm the public at large. And I hope you can see how, on the other hand, good palliative care, properly funded, available to all, is the humane answer to suffering at the end of life. So please focus on supporting healthcare properly and quieten the calls for assisted dying. And then for you, but not for the MPs, of course, assisted dying is morally wrong. So that's the end. Thank you all so much for listening. I hope the emotion and statistics were more or less bearable. So if we have any questions, perhaps we can take them after we hear from David and perhaps chat informally later on. Thanks.
So this is our website for the Anscombe Bioethics Centre, www.bioethics.org.uk, which is a very nice website and address actually. I mean, it was given to us by the father of a friend of mine when we moved from London to Oxford and became the Anscombe Bioethics Centre. So we have resources on all kinds of questions, top piece of news at the moment. So right on the front page, Anscombe Centre publishes a resource guide on assisted dying. So if I click that, it mentions that actually Elizabeth Anscombe herself, after whom the centre was named, had some involvement with the centre when it was called the Lineker Centre, and among which was that she drafted the central section of the report on euthanasia and clinical practice, which was then very important for the later submissions that we did for the House of Lords. But at the top here, it says Guide to Assisted Dying. So I'll click that. So this is our little research guide, and it just points to various things on the different parts of the website about assisted suicide or euthanasia. So we have a little section. We start with something about writing or speaking to your Member of Parliament. Dominic's already mentioned this. This is it's a very new Parliament. Very many members are new to Parliament, particularly Labour backbenchers. There's great uncertainty about what people's views are. We don't know what we don't know what a very large percentage of views are. Those that we do are quite divided. And it is possible, please God not, but it is possible that this could go the wrong way in 3 weeks' time. But it is also possible that it could go the right way. It is really on a knife edge. So it really makes a difference. It honestly really makes a difference. And we know that MPs are getting very many letters in a very organised way from people who are in favour of this legislation. So it's really important both to have people giving their own views from the heart, but even if they're not good at stringing sentences together, just to show that many people have concerns. So the simplest and quickest of emails just to say that people have concerns really is something which is still important, even if just to show that many people have concerns. So the simplest and quickest of emails just to say that people have concerns really is something which is still important, even if it's only to balance out other views that the MPs are getting. So we have just a little section on writing, which doesn't have lots of figures. We get linked back to figures, but which says it is best to focus on one issue or a couple of issues that concern you. It's always better to be more personal. Then we have another little section, 8 reasons why we must not legalise assisted dying, which I'll come back to, which is just like a summary of different arguments, different key arguments. Then we have another little section, 8 reasons why we must not legalise assisted dying, which I'll come back to, which is just like a summary of different arguments, different key arguments. Then we have much more detailed evidence guide, which we are in the process of updating. But even as it is, it has lots of information there about parliamentary reports, official statistics from lots of different jurisdictions, data on public opinion, medical opinion, and the various kinds of things which Dominic has talked about. There is lots about particular topics, and for each one, for example, there would be references to different articles, data in various places. So the best quality evidence, not just so that it's anecdote, but there's evidence of negative impact of euthanasia or assisted suicide from many different jurisdictions. So that's our guide to the evidence. But we also have particular briefing papers that we've done on particular topics. So if I go to that section, we have 9 papers at the moment in that section. We're hoping to get a couple more out before the debate. We start with defining our terms. The Slippery Slope by John Keown, who's a professor in Georgetown and has been writing on this subject for many years. Mark Conrad, who's a psychiatrist, looks at the situation particularly for euthanasia for psychiatric disorders in Canada, and the proposal that is. We have a position paper which on Abrahamic views, on religious views from an Abrahamic perspective. This was something which came out of the Pontifical Academy for Life, but came out of a discussion between Rabbi Avram Steinberg and the Pope about setting out what we have in common as Christians, Muslims, and Jews on end-of-life issues. So we reproduced that here. something on dignity and dementia from Pia Matthews, something on particular euthanasia case studies from Belgium, something on the principle of autonomy, on disability, and quite a detailed look at that question, which Dominic also touched on, about suicide prevention, and does this help? Does changing the law help or hinder? And I think that there's good evidence that it actually hinders. We have some videos which I'll just, so there's some list there, but that's a playlist. And then we also give some other useful resources that people might be interested in, including Care Not Killing, Living and Dying Well, which is another organisation linked to Parliament, which gives information about this. The Bishops' Conference website has an excellent page that it's put up on opposing assisted dying, and the disability group Not Dead Yet has good resources, including a link to an excellent documentary by the actress and disability rights campaigner Liz Carr called Better Off Dead. And then just, if I briefly go up again, so what are my 8 reasons why we must not legalize assisted dying? So let's have 8 reasons in 4 minutes. Firstly, that it overturns the fundamental principle of law and morality, which we'll be familiar with, but I think it's also, and I was cognizant of us as the Anscombe Centre, that we shouldn't start with consequences, but we should start with principles. And it is a fundamental principle that it's inherently wrong to intentionally take the life of the innocent. And this is something which is foundational for all societies and foundational for healthcare, which is why euthanasia or assisted suicide remain illegal in the vast majority of countries of the world. Even though we hear all the time about the countries where it has changed, it hasn't changed in most places. My second point is that sometimes it's said, oh, it's just about giving a choice to a small number of people who will take that choice. But what I think is hugely important for people to recognize is that changing the law changes things for everyone. Changing the law doesn't just change the law for one person. Changing the law changes the culture. It changes what's possible. It means what's possible is now floating there as something which either you welcome or that is threatening, but it's changed it. And it means that people who previously were, as it were, alive by default now feel that they may have to justify being alive or remaining alive. And again, it was touched on by Dominic, but in Canada, the standards, the model standards of practice for doctors in Canada make it now an obligation on doctors to raise the issue with people who may be eligible, even if the person hasn't mentioned it themselves. So doctors are actually mandated to raise this as an issue with patients, and a lot of patients find this very threatening, and certainly it changes the nature of the relationship. People feel pressure to end their lives because they feel a burden to others, and that's not just a thought or what might happen. We have evidence, we have very clear evidence of that. It's what is happening in places where they've changed the law. In Oregon, up from 13% to 54%, saying that they felt a burden, and that was one of the reasons they did this. In Washington, next door to Oregon, higher figures, up from 23% to 59%, saying that it was in part because of feeling a burden. And then the issue of suicide, and I'm aware of time, so I'll just skip through, but just to mention the normalizing of the idea that, at least for some categories of people, it's a reasonable thing to think. It's a reasonable to think, oh, let's end it all. And that undermines that fundamental principle that every suicide is a tragedy. We've seen, and I think it's important to note, that once legalized, the practice expands. So what people legalize is not what they get. They get something which will be much more expansive. So the idea that when you could legalize something and then you could restrict it just to these small categories, that's naive. And in Canada, as we've seen, even though they only legalized it in 2016, and they're half the size of us in population. 2 years ago, they had 13,000 deaths, which is extraordinary. That it jeopardizes funding of palliative care. And again, something which isn't often pointed out, but I think is worth pointing out, even though wanting to have assisted suicide for reasons of pain remains one of the least common reasons for asking for assisted suicide, it's increasing in places like Oregon and Washington and Canada. So these places which have assisted suicide, year by year, they're having more people who are concerned about pain. So the effect of changing the law has actually paradoxically been to widen a fear of pain, or even an experience of pain among patients, because of its impact on indirect impact on palliative care, I think. Last but one, and I think for practical reasons really important at the moment, is to think about its effect on given the state of the NHS as we have it. I mean, this is in a way a pragmatic, circumstantial, consequential argument, but consequences and circumstances are also part of the moral act. They're also part of politics. And I think that they also resonate with people, and particularly I think resonate with Labour MPs in terms of why they think of they're going into politics and what they're concerned about. That even if you thought it was a good idea, it can only be a good idea if it's a real choice. And it can only be a real choice if you have a real alternative. And at the moment, we're not providing that alternative. So doesn't become a real choice, it becomes a kind of coercion. And this is the kind of Wes Streeting's point. Wes Streeting, who voted in favour of such legislation in 2015, and now finds himself as Health Secretary and is just not comfortable being in favour of saying that the NHS could roll this out safely, even if you thought it was acceptable in principle. And I mentioned Liz Carr's documentary before, but I think if you haven't seen it, it's well worth seeing. She goes to Canada, she talks to a doctor who has scarily euthanized more than 400 people, who tries to persuade her that this is a wonderful thing and she should consider it herself. Just hearing disabled people talk about the kind of reactions they get from some people some of the time, I think is just well worth hearing and well worth telling people about.
David and Dominic, thank you very much for two very fine presentations. And thank you to the brethren who've joined this event today. I'm going to be having to disappear briefly, which is why I've asked to come on now, because I've got to go and catch an aeroplane. But just a couple of things that I felt would be helpful to say. As everybody knows, we put out to every parish the information and the, what do you call it, those QR code things to go into parish newsletters to help people to write into their MPs. So if those of you who are responsible for parish newsletters, if you haven't done that yet, please make sure that you do. I was interviewed by ITN the other week for their Southern Region News thing. And I took the opportunity there to speak about palliative care, the very point that Dominic's been speaking about, that we have this fantastic palliative care provision in this country, and the funding is short. As a number of you will know, the old Crawley Hospice has now moved to a new site just around the corner from my house, up at Pease Pottage. It's a beautiful facility. The rooms are fantastic, lovely staff, really top-class facilities. And I was going around there with their fundraiser, and she was saying, we want to put another wing on this, even than what we've got already, and it's bigger than what was there before. But we can't, because we're having to lay off staff. So if you're writing to MPs yourselves or speaking to parishioners about this, I would counsel you to ask them to include a plea for proper funding for palliative care. The answer to the problems that we're looking at and the issues that our faithful face, the answer to it is not euthanasia or assisted dying. It's good palliative care. And we're already good at it. And if I may just share a personal experience, one of my cousins in Canada, retired brigadier in the Canadian Army. It wasn't motor neurone, but it was one of those kinds of conditions. And I can't remember the name of it. It was some very complicated name. But he opted for euthanasia. And he was asked to give consent by blinking. So now the poor guy, that was pretty much all the physical movement that he had. But I would question whether blinking, which is a natural reaction and we're all doing it all the time, is a valid means of gaining consent. His sister, who they have relatives here in England, she was visiting a few months ago and asked to come to see me to talk through what had happened. She said that the family had been asked to gather in the room where this was to take place. They were there when he gave this consent, in inverted commas. And once he had given it, he then screamed the place down because he kind of realized what he'd done. But by then it was too late. I just, I want to share that with you. I think it's a rather powerful example. Dominic's given us two in his presentation, but very, very, I think a very powerful example of where we might end up here. I'm afraid I'm going to have to run, but can I just thank you all for joining? It's great to see. Not sure how many screenfuls of people we've got, but thank you for all of you for being part of this, and thank you to David and Dominic for spending time with us today.